artist, an amazing artist, but also an exceptional person. And so today I'd like to introduce Dorothy Cross.
Thank you all for coming and leaving the sunshine outside. When Mary invited me to do this, I couldn't say no to Mary Redmond anyway, but I did latch very much onto the title of the series, which was Cultural Entrepreneurship, and I thought how mad this is, and how can I apply anything I've ever done to that notion. But then I actually got very excited about the word entrepreneur, which comes from prendre, to take in French, and entre, between. So you're taking something from between things, you know, so it's about opposites. It's actually about everything I've always worked with. So what I'm going to do is actually, because the series also involves a little bit talking about the violence in design. Wonderful in terms of very rigid in terms of concept. Then I had itchy feet. I always thought art existed in bigger countries. So I went to California. I won a little travel award for jewelry design and went to live in San Francisco, went to the Art Institute and did an MFA in printmaking. So it was kind of all around the world for sport. I stayed away 10 years, then knew always I wanted to come back to Ireland. Never for a moment did I worry about surviving as an artist, which is a very strange thing. I came from a kind of middle-class bourgeois family, but it wasn't rich enough to kind of fund me. So I funded myself after my BA, just working in restaurants and stuff. And I managed to get funding for my MFA by writing to rich companies and asking for sponsorship. And a wonderful man funded my MFA, just by chance, and the kind of naivete and belief in art, I think, permeated through to him. And he phoned me up at midnight in San Francisco and said, "How much money do you want?" And I tell this story always because I feel it's terribly important to, especially for younger people, to know that that's a possibility. And it's much easier when you're younger, I think. So then I stayed on in America and traveled around and came back to Ireland. And I'll show you images in a moment, but I think all along the route, there has been this interest in the dynamic of elements that play between each other. When I came back first, I was living in a basement flat for years. I knew nobody. I was lucky enough to kind of just keep working. The bits of work filtered into some group shows, and then Patrick Murphy gave me a show in the Douglas Hyde, which was just like the biggest gift because I adore that space, which I always hear is under threat, and I think it should be saved. If it's ever threatened to close, we should all fight against it being closed. It's a very beautiful volume of space. So in the early days, it was a case, a little bit of teaching in NCAD or Limerick, going on the train, sleeping in damp B&Bs, you know, coming back to my damp apartment, but always making. And after the printmaking MFA, I never really went towards printmaking again. But what printmaking did for me was it taught me how to talk about art, I think, because I had to hide behind some facade of meaning, because I never knew what the work meant. So I would, the kind of gullible nature of Americans, I don't know if any of you are American, when it comes to culture and other countries, I think they love Irishness. So I used to hide behind Samuel Beckett, and I did series and series of prints based on Beckett's plays. So I used to only speak about Beckett. But in a way, it taught me how to navigate the essence of perhaps what it was I was trying to do, which I didn't know back then. Then when I came to the point of leaving California, I guinea pigged myself to the Carl Jung Association in San Francisco. I couldn't afford to pay the full rates, but I went to become an analysand on a cheap rate to a guy who was doing his qualifications, and his name was Mark Irish. And it was a big, big thing to come back to Ireland. I was terrified of it. I thought I might sink into a quagmire of kind of darkness, and yet at the same time couldn't bear the thought of getting old in America, where you would be kind of forced to have a facelift. So I came back and just continued to work. So what I'll show you today, and that whole thing of entrepreneur, the whole notion of it, actually, a friend of mine said, you should hold up your bank balance because everybody thinks entrepreneurship is about being rich and making money. But what Mary has done in this strange, mottled crew of invitees is we're all so different. But it is something about not taking one side or the other. It's about some kind of survival in some weird kind of tributary that flows between kind of edifices. And when the first work that really started feeding into that was based on my early interest in Jungian analysis, which was very much about the animus and the anima, looking at the male and the female side. And even now, when I think of that, it's too simplistic, because the first betweenness is in your birth, in some sense. It's between the mother and the father. We're made up from sperm and egg. So that whole notion of singularity and accepting one thing over the other has always seemed foreign to me in a strange way. Even though I am a woman and I don't have a sperm, I'm sure if I was talking here in 50 years' time or 100, I'll have both. Things are going to change. But also that thing of time in terms of talking now in 2015, we're talking in terms of the limitations of our body now, which will, I'm sure, be monstrously, and I will admit I sometimes fear that notion of the monstrous, because the spirit-body or energy-body relationship to the earth and nature for me is incredibly important. So that between, I've selected some slides which kind of talk about that, because I think when I first made them, these works, the other works, which a lot of you might be familiar with, were done in the early 90s, after I had found a sieve made out of an udder in northern Norway. And I was so shocked and thrilled by this sieve, because I saw a different function for the cow, that I came back to Ireland and started making works with these teats, getting the cows skinned the wrong way around in the abattoir where they were killing them for dog food or leather. And then having this extraordinary kind of feast of all the psychoanalysts were hopping up and down and thrilled, because you had this fabulous confusion of territory between the teat and the phallus, because when the teat hardens, it becomes very rigid and very phallic. And this piece called Amazon was very much the kind of pivot of that series of work, because it was an udder that arrived in my studio with only one teat. And I was terribly upset because they cost €100 and it only had one teat. But in fact, it worked out much better, because she became this single-breasted, in inverted commas, mannequin. I found the tailor's dummy in a junk shop, and I gave her this enormous singular teat, which is very, very phallic on the tip. So that play between the animus and anima, or the male and female, was in those days, for me, very thrilling territory. And it wasn't, I often say this, it wasn't about trying to claim strength for women, because I never for a moment faltered in terms of believing or not believing that we had it, which is another thing. Maybe that's something genetic, or maybe it's something learned, maybe it's something that occurred through the way my parents communicated or didn't communicate. But at the same time, it was trying to make an icon or physically manifest something that brought in that confusion or that lack of certainty. And this piece, these were two beautiful granite balls that came from a gatepost, and I just put a teat on both. And my grandmother had a sewing kit with all these elastics, so I just tied them on almost like bras onto these balls. And so you have that mixture of vulnerability and, again, the rigidity of the little teat. So that really ran for about 3 or 4 years. And in some ways, people were, I think, really appalled. A lot of people found it grotesque. And I can understand that, because when I was working with them, I felt a little bit upset and perturbed by the fact that I was working with these soft, dead animals, even though I wear leather. And there was a real kind of invasion of the animal in that work. But in the end, when they came out and became these maybe 20 or 30 works I only ever made using others, they had their own kind of character and their own gender in a funny way. And recently I did a book, or a set of books, where my father took photographs when I was younger. We had this very lovely situation where we had a big, big old house in Montenotte in Cork, which is kind of a joke, you know, it's a bit like the Fox Rock of Dublin, but more beautiful and more crumbling. And my mother had a real eye for beauty, and my father bought this big freezing cold house, and we were brought up there in the city. But every year we went for 3 months to the sea to a place called Fountainstown. And about 3 years ago, I did a series of books with a wonderful publishing house in Cork called Occasional Press, and it was funded by Ballynahinch Castle. And we called one Montenotte and one Fountainstown, using the photographs that my father took and interspersing them with my work, with only 1 page of text. So in fact, it was absolutely plopping in my things amongst the proof of my parents' existence, or the legacy of theirs, or the only thing that remains, because they both... Actually, my mother was still alive when the books came out, and she was great. She just sat and leafed through them, you know, cows, teats, everything, and just made lovely, lovely comments. She was completely accepting about what I did, which was a blessing. She mightn't have understood it. You know, she would phone me up sometimes and say, "Can you explain that to me, darling? Because your aunt, my sister, is driving me crazy saying, what does it mean?" And I would try to explain to her, and I would know, got it through in one ear and out the other. But I just flicked these last night on the camera, but this is my mother in her cocktail dress going out to a dinner party next to the Amazon. So the work was made up of these kind of combinations that could be translated in a very kind of, you could talk about them very literally. And sometimes when I speak, I feel, am I being too literal? And even taking up that notion of entrepreneur, you know, I actually think that's what it's all about, being an artist. Because there's no such thing as one brilliant, isolated piece of work or one bad piece of work. It only can be considered in relationship to what it's surrounded by. And I've spoken about that before, and it's something that excites me more and more in terms of how one places work in an exhibition space and how important that is to make relationships. This is my mother's very elegant legs coming in from the garden next to a pair of stiletto shoes with cow's teats that were playing around with the bound feet notion. And this was a piece that was made, now when you go into the computer to try and find images, there are too many, but this is a piece that was very much about the body between two arms pointing in opposite directions. It was for a show in Denmark called 96 Containers, which architecturally was actually fabulous. In the docklands of Copenhagen, this architect had like Lego, had put together all these containers, and 5 artists from each curator from different harbour towns were invited to put a piece of work in each container. And you just went up ladders and around all these containers. And I made a piece called Arms, which was playing about, it was playing around the notion of, you know, transporting firearms, but also about the result of arms in terms of the obliteration of the body. But in this particular case, the arms are pointing in 2 different directions. So coming from Ireland, everybody that went into the container knew that it was Irish, so you had that thing of separation and opposition and direction going in 2 different directions. And those ones were cast in bronze. And maybe I'm forcing things, but the Ghost Ship in some ways was about because it had gone into memory. This was a public piece in Dublin Bay in the early 90s, where we painted a beautiful old lightship with phosphorus paint and we tried to create a glowing kind of ephemeral thing in the middle of the bay. It was very technically very difficult to do. But it was very much about that. Actually, something I'm very interested in is theatre and reality, because this boat had lived in real terms out in the ocean with 12 or 13 seamen sitting in it, chained to reefs underwater to mark them so nobody will sail into them and crash. And they had the lights on top because they couldn't build a lighthouse there. But they had all been decommissioned, most of them except two that still exist, in the 70s. But it had been very much part of my father's time of sailing. And when we were kids, we used to go out to visit these men and bring them newspapers and cigarettes. But now this decommissioned one sat like a big whale pulled up in Grand Canal docks for years and years and years. You probably saw it down there, faded red. And we were allowed to borrow it for a period of a few weeks and try and create this illusion of a ghost. So even that, in terms of what had lived possibly and now lives in a different way, that does end up being a theatre. Because in some sense too, even in the way I'm talking now, is a theatre, if I spoke tomorrow, would be different. It's something that I can't plan a talk, because if you do plan it, you're blocking things out, I think, in a funny way. It becomes too regimented. And yet, I don't know if Mary has poets on. Have you poets on this lecture series? Because the way poets use words is so fantastic about multiplicity, and also how they're trapped between other words. But I couldn't really think like that. And yet, so I think for artists, I fear the concrete in terms of discussion. So my discourse around art, in some ways, shouldn't be any different than any of your discourses around my art or anybody else's art. And that's why, too, I think the whole thing of personal, being upset about what people think, that's so we should be able to openly criticize or discuss. Criticism and discussion, maybe criticize has become a bad word, but people are so afraid of discourse, which includes criticism. And then I think the art world, we petrify ourselves by the constrictions of language sometimes, which is impenetrable. But then at the same time, I know that I speak in circles, and people might say, "Get to the point, girl." So I'll move to the next slide. This is a piece, again, getting into theatre, that was one of my favorite pieces, where you bring in opera to talk about passion and loss. And this was a piece called Chiasm. It's one of the favorite things I ever did, in a set of handball alleys in the back of a school in County Galway called St. Enda's. And the schoolmaster let me use his alleys, and we painted the floor white. We had big cherry pickers, and we projections of the wormhole from the back of the Aran Islands into the floors. In one alley, you had a soprano, and in the other alley, you had a tenor. And I extricated little phrases of love and loss from about 20 different romantic operas, from Monteverdi to Strauss to Mozart to whoever. And then we projected, what you had was this beautiful Rorschach pattern. If you sat in the middle wall, you could see both alleys. But what this was doing was very much about this wall between the male and the female lovers, singing from the human attempt to depict the heights of passion and loss operatically, which in some senses is the most... the other day, actually, I was looking to try and find human compositions, who else is going to compose it, of the voice of God. And, if you think about it, it's very hard to find. And then somebody said to me, "Are you just looking for Christian gods? You're looking for Apollo?" But to try and find that, surely that would be the highest, or is it any higher than looking for love? I'm not sure. But to try and isolate those things and have them hang in the air. And with Chiasm, what was so beautiful was there was no orchestra, so you only had their voice, and it did just hang in the air, and then suddenly you came into the loss. So you had that, and they weren't orchestrated together. We put the music down, and we pitched them so that they could sing without being kind of interrupted by difficult pitch. But they were not choreographed ever to respond to each other. At times they go into one duet from Romeo and Juliet, and then it's almost like they've forgotten it. And at the same time, the pool is spooling around under their feet. So you never have that sense of being grounded, which is something, I guess, again, with the whole kind of art thing, is is terribly important. To get solace and to encounter beauty, of course, is important. But then one knows that beauty is so elusive. But that is something, and another thing that I'm quite interested in is, when you encounter art that surprises you and is something that you have not met before, like a person that excites you, is that then it becomes familiar and then it grows less powerful, possibly. And with some of the works, like this behind is a still from a video called Jellyfish Lake, where I went with my brother to make a film in Australia about jellyfish. And there's a lake in Palau in Micronesia where there are thousands of these jellyfish. And I went there just to get footage because I knew we mightn't get the ones we wanted in Australia. And I saw them moving around my hair, and I got my friend to shoot these. And what happened was this beautiful kind of almost symbiotic relationship between these jellyfish that looked like they were checking me out and this kind of lyrical flowing hair. And they're non-stinging jellyfish, but we all kind of cringe, I guess, when we see a jellyfish because we think it's going to sting. But that kind of suspense was very much part of that. But in the end, what you get is actually quite balletic. But then they are very balletic animals when you're with them underwater. It's only when you find them on the beach and they're like, snots or slime. And in Irish, the word for the translation for a jellyfish is smuggle roin, which means snot of the seal, which is fantastic. So this next piece is one of my favorite pieces as well. Actually, about 3 years ago, I went to. These are the perks of art, but they become kind of adventures. And I was asked to do something for the Bloomberg Centre in London, which is this centre of the value of commerce, of currency. They're all working in offices, and you can see them, talking about the value of the dollar or the yen or whatever. And we were asked, 2 artists at a time were asked to put a show in there. So I knew that pearls were the highest level of value on the planet in the 15th century. And I had always in the back of my head, that's a little bit how it works. I have a terrible memory, but I do have little nooks in my head where I hold things that I love somehow. And so the pearl was always there as something I thought, God, I'd love to work with pearls. And I knew about their biology or zoology. I have a brother who feeds me information, and always, even as a kid he did. He's quite a lot older than me. And it was always just a wonderful kind of a feeding bag for me. So I went to Palau in Micronesia because my brother put me in contact with a pearl farmer there with a set of finger bones that I had from a hand that my aunt, who was a pathologist in Cork, had given to me, because in those days bones lay around the house in a pathologist's house. Now it's so different. So I was in the plane with these fingertips of some human being, kind of thinking of the person actually. And they were small, so we thought it was possibly a female. And we brought them to these farmers, and they put them into these black-lipped oysters, 1 fingertip into each oyster, and then they put them out into the middle of Rangirog Lagoon, and I hoped that the animal would cover them with pearl, with nacre, which is like a scab of beauty, because we all love pearls. So that piece was very much about looking at beauty as opposed to grotesque or fearful or the bone. And what happened was fabulous. Well, I kind of think it's miraculous, but then I think nature is miraculous. I put a baby tooth in one, and it came out covered in that particular one, you can see. And the other one, what occurred was that a lot of the animals rejected the bones, because that's how a pearl is made. It's made from an irritant that's in the animal's body, and it's like they cover it with a smooth nacre to stop it irritating them, regurgitated food and things like that. But what happened, which was poetry in itself, was that only 1 finger got covered, and it was the index finger, which made it more beautiful. But that's something that still continues in what I'm doing today, I think, very much. And a show I had in the Curlin. Oh, then getting back a little bit to the story, I was in the basement flat for years. Then you get a few breaks, like Patrick Murphy gave me the show in the RHA, or on the Douglas Hyde, after having a little show in the Triskel in Cork, where I came from, and just kind of doing the regular route, really. That I suppose I was, it felt natural to show in a little gallery in Cork, then show maybe in the Hendricks in a group show. And I think I was lucky, actually, that nobody knew me at all. I hadn't studied here, so I had a lovely, fresh background. None of the tutors knew me, none of the gallerists. That could work possibly against you, but I think for me it was better because you know, they hadn't judged me right or wrong before they ever saw the work. The Curling Gallery came and asked me to show with them in the early 90s when I was working with the others. And then you kind of have a relationship with those galleries, now, whatever it is, 40 years later. And you show there every 2 years or so. And I show in a gallery in London called Fifth Street the other 2 years. And it's kind of nice because it's like your home harbour. You get to know the spaces very well. And that becomes a kind of it is like you're showing home. But for me, it's terribly important to get out and go to, you know, Papua New Guinea or wherever to kind of find whatever it is that's interesting about the work and try and have it emerge from those places, like whether it's a shark caller in Papua New Guinea or a pearl farmer in Bloomberg. And it's funny what happens when you go to those places, because when I went to the pearl farmers first, they were all big tattooed Tahitians, and they were all sitting at little desks with their calipers, very skillfully popping pearls out of these oysters. And they grow 3 different sizes, and each animal can grow up to 3 different diameters of pearl in their life. So they're like breeding farms, really. And then it's very gynecological. They pop in the new little bead, which is made of shell, to create what they consider the perfect pearl, which is round. Of course, the way I work, I prefer the Baroque ones, and that's where the word Baroque comes from the deformed pearl, which is another lovely thing. When I got an invitation from Sarah Glennie about 2 years ago, she's the new director of IMA, and I had worked with her on the Ghost Ship, and so we knew each other very well, and she said, would I be interested in doing this exhibition where I would be allowed into the National Museum on Kildare Street, the National Gallery, the Crawford and IMA, and select from those 4 collections and make a show. And I said, can we add on the Natural History Museum? And then we went into the National Sound Archives, but it was becoming too big, so we had to pull back. But what it was like in the beginning was like, my God, it was like going into these treasures, these football pitches full of objects. Like out in Swords, they keep all these things that belong to the Natural History Museum. Vast spaces. You could kind of cycle around for days and you wouldn't see everything. I went in and just went ding, 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 beautiful, 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 love, 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 take photographs, and then go back to my house and get totally confused and think, how can we accommodate all these things? And when I went into the National Gallery, I'm not meant to be showing you this actually, but this was one of the first photographs I found, and it's so beautiful. There's a whole rack of paintings that have been damaged, and some of them, the provenance is unknown, so they can't be lent. So very early on, I saw prohibition lights coming up, which are red rag to a bull when you're an artist, because nobody ever says no to you. It's funny. In a funny way, nobody does. You only say no to yourself. There's no authority other than yourself. You know, I have a friend who I adore, and he still lives in New York, and he was a brilliant artist, and he stopped making art because he was looking for some kind of confirmation from outside, from something other than the work giving you the confirmation itself. And I remember I had a review somewhere, and he was so impressed, and I was thinking, oof. And he just stopped making art because of that. And my belief really is that the work, in the end, if the work is right, it's complete confirmation of itself, and then it's gone. And that is the balm, and that's the excitement, and that's the fuel. And hopefully then it's a fuel for whoever meets it. Now, you know, you're lucky if it meets people in the same, or in a way that will make them enjoy it, but you know it's not going to work for everybody. So anyway, that whole thing of the daunting aspect of going into IMA and all these places and looking at all these things, thinking, how can you bring these things together too? I had no notion in the beginning how it was going to happen. So these racks, I immediately said, yes, 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 I want all those. And they said, no, you can't have them. And I went home, and so I was really kind of petulant. I was like a kid stamping my feet. I thought, God damn it, this is not possible. And I kept sending emails saying, this is not impossible. And this was another case in point in the National Gallery of a wonderful assumption that has these beautiful pieces of tissue paper marking the points that are weak, that need to be strengthened or conserved. And they do brilliant jobs in there. They do keep these things safe. I'm very aware of that. And I wasn't wanting them to be abused by being brought to IMA, but it was going to come to a temperature-controlled space in a truck with art handlers, and I knew that nothing would happen to them. But I still wasn't allowed to have them. So there were a bit, I did nearly pull out, actually. It's quite funny. Sarah was very politic. She managed to stop me pulling out. So what I'm going to show you here is just some of you might have seen it, but it was kind of great fun in the end. It could have been a much, much bigger show. We were limited to the 8 rooms in the garden galleries in IMA, but I actually like the domesticity of them in a funny way, because I think it's more alienating if you did go into the RHA or whatever. So there is something about one's body in these spaces that is more at home, because I'm very conscious of our own bodies in terms of being part of the furniture, kind of, really. So in the particular case of the Assumption, in the end we projected the image, which funnily enough, kind of worked in a way, because it was about pushing it almost into the territory of transformation, because she's floating up into the sky. And it's a beautiful Assumption, because there's an empty casket on the bottom, and a lot of the human focus is into the void, and she's already in that passage into the heavens. And I suppose that was my early introduction to art, was those wonderful, early Renaissance paintings in places like the National Gallery. And in that particular room, we put a chair from the Crawford made of red pinky velvet that was very much like the kind of chair I had in our house growing up in Montenotte, wing chair, and a beautiful painting by Pat Hall of a little meteorite. And at the foot of the chair, Nigel Monaghan, who runs the Natural History Museum, he's fabulous, he showed me the biggest meteorite they have in the collection. This particular one actually is from Argentina. And we just placed it, it weighs 8 ton, it's like solid iron, and just put it almost like a footstool in front of this throne-type, comfortable Bourget chair, facing the Assumption. And the beauty of these things, God, especially, there's something about seeing things in storage where they're in darkness a lot of the time, they're not seen by human eyes a lot of the time, that makes them more precious in a funny way. And because it gives you the power of discovery somehow. And going into a gallery or a museum, you don't have that power. Very often you have an awful little rope, or you have a guard telling you to keep away, or whatever it is. You have too many other people making noise. There is that intimacy that occurs. And in this particular case, it was a Tintoretto of this slightly strange-looking man emerging out of blackness. And the beauty of the fact that only his face and his hands are clear, and the kind of strange, kind of almost distorted anatomy because of that, which I thought was absolutely beautiful. The National Gallery stores actually are fantastic. This was a little kind of regiment of busts, and I said, can I have them all? And they were great. They said, yes, I could have them all. But they gave me different ones, actually, in the end. But it didn't really matter. I just wanted humans carved in marble. For some reason, they were important enough to be depicted in this bust way. These are my funky little panoramas from my iPhone that I hope you can see properly. But I actually love them, because the thing about these rooms, there were 8 rooms, and it was very difficult to bring the whole scenario together, because there were scenarios. And a bit like what I do in my own shows, I was trying, and this room in particular, which was in the basement, some people said, oh, Dorothy, it's just like your own work. And I felt that was a bit dismissive. But it was just like my own work, if I had access to a Tintoretto and 5 whale skulls and 5 busts. So what we did was just placed a whale skull, a bust, a whale skull, a bust, a whale skull, a bust along this kind of walkway. And actually, I'll go back to that. And what was beautiful was normally you don't see the back of a bust. So you had that lovely kind of concave other side that in some ways related bone-like to the whale that normally we wouldn't be focusing on in that detail. In the old days, they always disposed of skeletons. Now they're seeing their value, and a lot of people are actually preserving them. And I've preserved one myself in my own land, so I'm very familiar with the structure. But it was very much about portraiture, that room. So I was trying to bring together that thing of portraiture. But again, the opposites of animal head and human head. And I did one little, and this is, I thought was a lovely combination between a tiny Joseph Higgins painting from the Crawford and a Thomas Ruff digital high-def portrait of this young girl, which is massive. And the Higgins' girl is looking sideways, and there's something very vulnerable and innocent about the hand touch of the painting. Not being a painter, I think it made me much more interested in painting, doing this show, actually. And this just shows you in the Natural History Museum storage in Swords how they place things. This was a meteorite stack, so that kind of led to the placement of the runway. It was like a kind of model's runway in the portrait room. One after the other with this man, this kind of merging out of darkness at the top. Because that other thing too between, what is clear and what is unclear, like going back to the early days of kind of the unconscious, playing around with Jung. And it was play, because I always found Carl Jung much more playful than Freud, who was much more strict, that you could have multiplicity in terms of interpretation. And that's so important when it comes to the visual art. There is no certainty. There is no right and wrong. If you love or you hate, they both are as valuable as each other. And the work has to navigate through the world and will inevitably change wherever it is. If it's under your bed or if it's in the Tate, it's the same thing, but it will change in terms of how it's held. But this was one of we had a game when we were working on it. There were a lot of really nice people working on it. That what would you rob if you could? And I would have stolen this entire cabinet. It's a series of fossilized shark's teeth with miniatures. There's a wonderful, wonderful collection of miniatures in the print and drawings and Hodge runs in the National Gallery. And Robert Emmet is in the middle, and there are two little tiny Gainsboroughs over here. And what I did was I slipped in a picture of my mother just above the Gainsboroughs, that little kind of fair-haired woman. She was only 13, and she had her miniature done when she was in London. She was of that privileged level. But she had passed on when I did this, but I adored that she was surrounded by fossilized shark's teeth. And she would have adored that herself. Because it's about value, isn't it? It's about what we consider precious and what we don't consider precious. And the older I get, getting back to the finger bone and the pearl, our own skeleton, and our relationship to that, it's terribly important. And even the Tintoretto, all we can see, if you look closely, you can see the rest of his body, but the hands and the head are like these kind of, ghosts coming out of blackness. And you're aware of the passage of time when you're looking at it. But that can be comforting as well as unnerving. It's not necessarily about discomforting. But in this particular case, and in lots of my work, that thing of what is violent or aggressive or possibly misunderstood in relationship with what is precious and prized, like a portrait of Robert Emmet, who was killed in the end, but, and some of these other people whose names I actually don't know. And there's a beautiful little thing down in this corner. It's a little spyglass covered in shagreen, which is the skin of a shark. And there's Robert and a tooth. And these lovely happy accidents aesthetically occurred where the colour of the tooth just absolutely mirrored the colour of the little portrait of Emmet. So we did play with the aesthetic as well. Now, I know I'll talk for about a few minutes, and then we'll get questions if you want to. But I loved this thing, and I ran into massive trouble. It was from the Museum of Country Life in Castlebar, which is a fantastic museum, not far from where I live in Connemara. And I lived in Dublin for 15 years after I came back in these really old industrial old places where I kept having to move on after about 5 years because I didn't own any of them. So then I moved to Connemara 15 years ago. I kind of was old enough to survive. That's what I say to students anyway, because I think as a student to live in the boonies, very difficult to survive. Even with technology, I think you have to do your years in cities. There's a snobbish, small, fashionable thing about making art, and you kind of have to be part of the vibrancy of I would argue that. Now, I'm sure some people can survive and suddenly pop up as in strangeness from the countryside, but I'd say generally speaking, you have to be older to survive in nature. So I was something like 45 when I went to live there. And this museum in Castlebar, I found this fabulous tubby cash register, and I went immediately, fabulous, I want it, and I was told I couldn't have it. So because their worry is that it needs conservation, and it's too bad, and it will make their collection look bad. Now, I would argue absolutely till the cows come home against that, because I think the more vulnerable, the more beautiful. And even if you look at a preserved, over cleaned painting next to, I don't know if any of you when they dig up those Ardagh chalices and things in the National Museum, that wonderful National Museum, they'd sometimes put them on display covered in mud and all bashed up, and I always preferred them like that than when then they would show them all clean. And there's something that removes it from time and removes it from its own inherent history when you see it too clean. But anyway, they wouldn't give me the cash register, even though many conversations happened. And so we went on eBay, and Joanna, who worked with me in the museum, found this lovely one. And it was very important for me that this sat in the thing. And this is something in terms of being an artist that you can't avoid. How do you survive? How do you pay the rent? How do you pay the mortgage? Some years I still have to struggle with that. But I'm really lucky that I've managed to survive to be this old and make art. So it was very important for me that the energy of money was in the middle of Trove, because all those national institutions rely on money, and the whole art world is completely entrapped by value. And it's such a downfall for so many of us, and it can really turn you off. But I think I was born without a compass for money, so I'm really lucky. It means I'm not really rich, but I'm rich in other ways. But so I think if you're worried too much about money, it can be a killer when it comes to art. So this sat in a room with, I loved this room actually. It sat opposite this fabulous Levens, which is a painting of an old man with a bald head. He was a friend of Rembrandt's, and a wonderful elephant bird's egg, which is like a rugby ball, and kind of mirrored the bald head. And then these ammonite, I think they were the oldest natural things in the show on geological boxes. So, and people who knew me actually came up to me after and said, I love the show, Dorothy, but what was with the cash register? And I thought it was so obvious that it was there. And also, it was referring to a period of money when money was still physical. Pounds, shillings, and pence. It had little tags that said fancy goods, 2 shillings, and the pound. Whereas now, the money has become much more virtual, and also the value of art in auctions and stuff has become immoral and outrageous and ridiculous. So it has a very important place in the whole panoply. And this, coming back to the body, this is the thing I would have robbed, but I wasn't allowed to borrow it. It's an Apollo, beautiful, beautiful sexual nubile boy in the store with a little ribbon around his waist with a little note, saying where he came from and stuff. But he was too fragile to travel. Now, he was another thing I thought could have come, because he'd been restored badly about 15 years ago. And to re-restore something, you have to break it again. And then make it okay. So I said, I bet it won't break, but if it does, then you can restore it. But it didn't work. But so what we did instead, and it was a bit of a compromise, because they took beautiful photographs of it in the National Gallery, and we put up the photographs of it as evidence of something that could have been held in these stones. Now this, I think this could have been the most beautiful thing in the world if that Apollo had been standing amongst these fabulous standing stones, which had been stored in the basement of the National Museum for, I think 16 or 18 years. And Ned Kelly was then the minder of them, and he allowed us borrow them all, actually. But in the end, the floor wasn't strong enough to hold them, so we could only use 10 of them. And I put them in this room with a painting by my friend William McKeown of this beautiful billowing light, and the picture of the Apollo. And in the corner, a tiny little Sheila and a gig. But again, I suppose it was interesting to, I have worked in opera, and I've worked in opera where I'm only the designer, so I have had to take direction from people that I mightn't have totally agreed with. But in this case, maybe it was a little bit similar. So that thing of compromise, and then how you deal with it, because there's an inherent feeling of failure if you're not going to put something up that you completely believe in and that you know could be better. It's just agony. So we put up the Apollo in these beautiful photographs, life-size, as they would have been if they existed there. And then I thought what I'd try and do is bring in the body. because that whole thing of the body, as the artist or the viewer, is that you are that pivot between what's in the space. And I said to Sarah, maybe we'd get a nude model. And first I thought an 18-year-old, a 40-year-old, and an 80-year-old, so it would be about time. And then that sounded a bit corny. And also they didn't have much budget. So we found this lovely man who models for the RHA for drawing. And he lives in Cork. And he came up on the train once a week for an hour and stood amongst the stones. And there was a sign on the door just in case people were freaked out by nudity, and just to tell them. And I thought, God, Dorothy, you don't ever really work. Is this performance? This is not really. You don't. It's about the absent body, in fact, most of my work, or about all of us occupying the space of the body. But I walked in and I nearly cried because he's in his 60s, and he just stood on the floor. When he wasn't there, we put a plinth to imply that something should be occupying it. And the colour of his skin was like the colour of the Willie McKeown painting. So you had that beautiful relationship between this kind of creaminess, and also you have a pulsating body that, in relationship to the stones, the limitations of our life on this planet compared to the ancientness of those standing stones, most of which came from Cork and Kerry, and had those wonderful wooden plinths built around them a long time ago. And Oscar Wilde's father actually was involved in their caring, and a lot of them have these lovely letters with W painted in red, which is William Wilde, which is Oscar's dad. So you have that lovely kind of history and care, and they're going to change these. Now that they go back into the world of museum, they're going to change those plinths because they're set into concrete and they think they shouldn't be. But I adore those plinths because they show another 150 years ago Victorian green paint, institutional, slightly chipped kind of beauty or the touch of another human being. And I'm nearly there now, but I won't show you all the rooms, but this was one of my favorite rooms. It was the Roy Keane room. And there's a portrait of Roy Keane in Cork taken by an English photographer called McMurdo. And I love Roy Keane because of his pursuit of excellence. I was a sports person, and I understand the effort involved I was a swimmer, in having to try and succeed. And I love the fact that he rages. I love the fact that he makes mistakes. And it was quite a beautiful photograph, too. So we put him in the center, and it became this kind of chapel to Roy. And I had a brain coral, and an extinct bird that came from the same cabinet as the dodo, which was called a solitaire. Beautiful, poetry, absolutely, you couldn't write that one. And so, because I think he must be quite lonely, our Roy, as well. And a deflated football from the 20th century, early 20th century. And the fabulous painting, of the underside of a foot, and then a fake gun that had woodworm in it that the boys used for training when they didn't have enough rifles to go around in the Civil War. And then a painting called The Wounded Revolutionary, and two paintings of extreme emotion. You might be able to see a little bit better there. And on the far wall opposite Roy was a gorgeous portrait of Roger Casement that also came from the Crawford. And I chose it because he was beautiful, not because it was Roger Casement. I didn't know it was Roger Casement, and then was thrilled when I discovered it was Roger Casement. And that thing of kind of, that was part of the pleasure of the discovery in the show, was the kind of accident. And he fitted into that room in terms of, revolutionary guns, etc. And another wonderful, extraordinary man, completely different to Roy, but also incredibly beautiful. Like, look at those guys; they're amazing. The eyes, and the one on the left is an engraving of Roger Casement. Very, very beautiful. I'll end here in a minute. This was the last show, which kind of comes back to the Pearl, but it's the predicament that seems to grow the older I get in terms of manifestation is, how do you depict the undepictable? I suppose that's everybody. Although no, some people love painting apples, and they're happy with that for all their entire lives. But when you look at work that I suppose you can think of someone like Wolfgang Leib, who collects pollen from flowers. I often worry about the poor bees who had the pollen robbed, but he did do those beautiful, panels of pollen on the floor of the Douglas Hyde. or James Turrell, who makes those openings into the sky. There are works that refer to, and Willie McKeown in his own beautiful way, when he got it right, did these beautiful paintings that were purely about light. So I think in this last show that I did in the Curlin, in, I don't know when it was called View, and I was trying to play with that notion of our point of view and the view in terms of our vision from left to right. And what I tried to bring into it, and I'm not going to talk about all the work, but there's one piece in the end that kind of sums it up, was this scales that, it was just a coat hanger belonging to my mother. In the old days, I pilfered all the stuff that belonged to my parents, and my father gave me a lot of stuff, and I put it into the work, and then it was gone. And I always felt it was like an inheritance that was for me was necessary to transform and change and move on. And my father never saw it, but my mother did, and she was very accepting of it. You know, my grandmother's wedding train is inside a cow in a museum, you know, things like that. But this piece, I did find a skull once in a skip in Herbert Park. When I came back to live in Ireland, in California, you live off what you find on the street. You know, you find everything. Anything you don't need, you put on the street. It's really nice, recycling. And so I, you know, furnished my entire apartment out of stuff I found on the street. But when I came back to Dublin, I used to be digging around in skips. And here you'd find far less, you know, that was usable. But I found a marbled box. And I knew immediately it was a skull box because my aunt, the pathologist, had one. And when I opened it, it had all these little compartments. So it was an educational tool for medical students showing every part of the human skull. And I think we have 22 bones in our skulls, teensy-weensy ones, and then the lobes and everything. So I had it, and it was beautiful. And this is how I funded my life. I was going to India on a trip a long time ago, and I needed some money. So I sold it to a medical student friend for 100 quid. And it was gone. So then recently I thought, God, I wish I had that skull. So I phoned him up, and he'd given it to a girlfriend. So he didn't have the actual one, but he had parts of another one. So he gave them to me. And so I had these two lobes. And so what I did was, they are actual human skull. And the way of, I suppose, some people, you know, I have no problem with that because I think we are material and we will rot into the ground. And I would be very respectful of these things. I think, you know, some people might argue that I'm not, but what I did in this particular case was I took the right and left skull lobes, so it would hold the right and left parts of the brain, the intuitive and the rational, and I made them into the dishes for a set of scales, hanging off the edges of a pale blue coat hanger that belonged to my mother. That doesn't really matter that you know that, but you know, it's a lovely coat hanger. And, and I gilded the inside with pure yellow gold leaf, and which, you know, alchemically, transformatively is a very precious metal, and put into both of those little dishes a little pile of meteorites that have come from outer space. And this ties back to the assumption and the chair and the meteorite very much, in that what has come from, inverted commas, the heavens and landed on the earth. And I refer to them as dead stars, but somebody told me they're not stars at all, but I like to think they are. And in some ways, they did, when they move so fast, they create a trail of fire, I think. So what we could see could be light. And they come into this, our realm, which is, again, so limited if we look at the space. And you have this balance between the two halves of the brain that are holding something that comes way out from past our understanding. And in some ways, my heart lies very much in this territory now, and I think I'll end on that. I've gone a bit too long anyway, but that's just a piece that kind of in some ways sums everything up. But I'd be totally happy to answer questions if you have time to stay. I realize it's 2. Well, you know, one thing I never did, I never got a permanent job. And when I first came back to Ireland, I was on the dole. And then, my parents couldn't finance me once my father was dead, so that was over. They paid for my education. Up to my MFA, I paid for myself. And, that's when the man who funded me, that story, that was really valuable for me, because that really allowed me to stay 5 years in the States, working in a restaurant as well. When I came back to Ireland, it was the dole and living really cheaply, in a really cheap flat, without any studio for about the first 4 years. I worked in my flat. Then it would be Arts Council grants, which I applied to about 3 times before they gave me any, which I think is kind of pretty regular, because I think they feel you have to prove something, or you have to kind of just keep going so much that eventually they think, oh, she's around again, so maybe she's a survivor. Then I used to go and teach. I think because I had an MFA from the States, it made it a little bit easier to get a few teaching gigs. I went for a day a week to Limerick. And then as I got a little bit older, I shared time with Willie Doherty. We took time for people who took maternity leave and NCAD for 2 days a week. Never more than that. Because I think it's death. I think if you take a full-time job, it's death. And I've seen, some people can do it, but I think rare animals. Because it's very hard to have your own energy and do a full-time job. So then I used to paint bird signs for bird sanctuaries. I worked with that was a good one, actually, because I worked with a scientist, and these local authorities and chemical factories in Cork paid us. He'd research the birds, and I'd paint them. Not very well, actually. I copied them from books. I'm not brilliant as a bird illustrator. But I could do one of them a month, and I would get €1,000. And that kind of kept me going. Other than that, and then I got a Pollock Krasner. If you're an artist, it's a fabulous award anyone in the world can get. When Pollock died, Lee Krasner, his wonderful wife, put their money up for an award. You can apply for that through online. You could find it, and they're really good. It's not about how successful you are. It's purely on your work. So that was a big lump. It was $20,000 or something. And they're great. Check that out, Pollock Krasner Award. And then I guess, the first thing I sold was in the Hendricks. No, I sold a few little drawings in Cork, but they were, my uncle and aunt and things like that. And then in the Hendricks, I remember lovely Cecil King, the artist. It was such a boost for me. He bought a piece of work, and he was such a gentleman, gorgeous. So then 1 or 2 things would go, but the majority of my early work was scrapped or broken up, or even the whole show that went to ICA in Philadelphia called The Powerhouse. I took most of the control panels out of the power station, which was my studio. I used to get these studios that were really low rent, but really hard to live in. Smelt of shite and were freezing cold. But I wore a lot of clothes, and it was fine, that kind of thing. And I remember actually the fussiness of, I used to get really irritated by some students who kind of wanted everything. You just do it, and it's not like I suffered. My father used to go about having bare feet. It wasn't like that. It was like the Powerhouse was extraordinary, the place I worked in. But it was tough enough, and nobody else wanted to be there, so it was cheap. So then that's, I guess, how it went from there. And then even still, the work, I don't make much work, that's the other thing, because I don't stick with one thing and make 10 versions of it. Like I made 20 whatever others, but they were all different. And there's still some available if anyone wants to buy one. And I'm a useless businesswoman, and that's why you have a gallery who take 50%, and you go, oh, feck, when you see what you get out of a sale. But I love it because I'm not a good businesswoman. I don't like dealing with money. I probably should have done analysis sessions on that one. So I think I've been lucky, actually. And I also, a man once came to one of my very early shows in Cork, and a drawing had sold. And he said, can you do one like that for me? And I nearly got sick. And I said, no. You see, that I would never do that. To me, that is death. And it should be death for him, too. One like that for me, it's just desperate. So maybe it's a good thing that there's less work out there, and then you go into the problem that it gets expensive, and you get a bit embarrassed because it's expensive, and you can't afford to buy it yourself. But then you're not as expensive as Sean Scully, and you see Sean Scully doing millions of paintings and for 100,000 each. And that's a different ball game. They're very, very different ways of making art. But I think if you're kind of interested in trying to kind of scrape your own way through you have to kind of stick to your guns. And I think in the end, I really think it just naturally, like I might die a pauper, but I hope I don't, but I could easily. At the rate I'm going. Oh, I was on Aesthona then. I got an Aesthona the third time that I was promoted. And I lived off the canoes of that for about, I forgot that one. And that was actually, I know we all give out about it at times, but if you earn under 27,000 euros a year, you're allowed to get this thing called a canoes, which is 16, I think, thousand euros a year. So it really killed the wolf from the door for me for about 4 or 5 years. It did. And I'm off that now, thankfully, even though I'm still on the cusp of earning too much, you know what I mean? But, so that's it. That's a long answer. Okay.
Sorry, just a quick question on, you mentioned there are two words, was it polychrasmic and the canoes, is it? Can you just spell those?
The Pollock Krasner, Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner, they were American artists. He was a famous splash painting artist. And they set up the Pollock Krasner Foundation in New York. Pollock Krasner. Pollack Krasner. Yeah. And then the canoes is if you're a member of Aesthona, you're allowed to get this. It's like, I call it the dole, the kind of artist dole in a way. Okay. It's a little bit more than what you get if you were on the dole, I think.
Okay, right, thanks.
Oh, sorry. Anybody else like to ask a question? Or okay, Sophie? Yeah.
Yeah, my voice is out there. I'm just wondering. I'm fascinated about this whole notion of you like reusing like material that's in storage. I'm just wondering, like, are there functions born out of like a predetermined concept when you go into these storage rooms?
Good question. Yeah.
Is the concept like just born out of the knitting?
Yeah, yeah. Well, getting back to the entrepreneur, what happens between them, you know, to take from what's between. Yeah, so I knew before I went there that I wanted an elephant bird's egg, you know, for example, because I knew some of the things that existed there. So yeah, I kind of had a shopping list in my head of certainties, but then when I found the leavings of the bald head, it's a very obvious relationship, but then that went with the bird's egg. So what I did was I went back to my studio and printed out all these photographs of things I liked and pinned them up on the wall like a kind of collection of insects, and then I played with them. And relationships started occurring, which is not dissimilar to the way I work in my own work anyway, because I might have loads of stuff in my studio and not know what's going to happen. Because I rarely have, that's where it's very difficult if you're an artist. And you know, the other thing that you can live on sometimes, but I don't ever win them, are these public commissions, where you get invited to go to a roundabout and, you know, somewhere and at 3 o'clock on a day after you get the letter. And, you know, and then there's a committee that judges your proposal. But in that particular case, you have to, it's very hard if you're an artist here, you'll understand. You have to give them a finished idea, drawn up or put on, usually mine are kind of pasted together. Like the Ghost Ship would have been one of those, you know, that I put together the proposal. But that was easier because I had some certain passion and evidence of something that existed. But in that case, you have to come to the final thing before you even have the material in your hands. With the museums, they really told me the relationships. But some of them, we ended up in the rooms. Is this better here or there? There was orchestration that occurred at the very end.
And then would you see like perhaps like gaps in the montage that you would fill yourself with your own work?
In the Trove show, no. I didn't put any of my own work in that.
Oh, not
except
at
my
all.
mother.
Except, okay, yeah, that's what I heard.
Yeah. That was the only, and that was a little, it wasn't a joke. I loved doing it. It was something, a little surreptitious thing.
Okay, great. Anyone else? Well, it's time to thank you, Dorothy. That was a totally amazing talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. Did I stick to my little, is that all right?
That was amazing. I've never heard you, you know, it's much, you've talked more there than I've heard you talk.
Oh, have I?
Well, I've been to a lot of your talks, but not the
I
more.
know, it's because I think students, because I often tell my story with students, and I think they're a bit bored.